The Witch and the Definitely Dead Detective by Sadie Brent. Chapter 31. A Town Rallies. Word traveled fast in Stony Fork, as it always did in a town this small. And news as shocking as Hugo Bates being arrested for the murder of Lizzie Hutchison and the attempted murder of her great-niece spread faster than wildfire. By the next morning, Evie's phone wouldn't stop buzzing with texts and calls. Some were from friends like Annie, who immediately promised to come down and stay with her, but most were from people in town, neighbors she barely knew, asking if she was okay, offering their prayers, or promising to stop by with food. It was overwhelming, to say the least. Evie stayed upstairs in the small apartment above the shop for the next 2 days, barely venturing downstairs except to feed Spinks or grab coffee. The events of the attack replayed in her mind on a loop, each detail as vivid as the moment it happened. She barely slept, her thoughts darting between Hugo's chilling confession and the mysterious pull of the crypto-arcanum. Even now, safely tucked away in its hidden drawer in Lizzie's desk, the book seemed to hum at the edges of her mind, as if calling out to her. The sound of the bell over the shop door broke through her thoughts. Spinks perked up from his spot on the couch, and Evie forced herself to stand, smoothing her sweatshirt as she made her way downstairs. She wasn't surprised to see Marcellus stepping into the shop, but the sight of Frida Thomas, his no-nonsense assistant, trailing behind him with a covered dish in her hands, caught her off guard. "Evangeline," Marcellus said warmly, his voice filling the room like a soothing balm. He looked as polished as ever, his tailored coat brushing against the doorframe as he stepped inside. "We thought it was about time we checked in on you. He wanted to come right after it happened, but I convinced him you needed rest," Frida added with a wry smile, setting the dish on the counter. "I'm glad you're all right, Han. I made my famous chicken casserole. It freezes well if you don't want to eat it tonight." Evie smiled, her chest tightening at the kindness in Frida's voice. "Thank you, both of you." Marcellus crossed his arms, leaning against the counter as his gaze swept the shop. "How are you holding up?" "Better than I was a few days ago," Evie admitted. "But it's a lot." Marcellus nodded, his dark eyes soft with understanding. "I can't imagine, but if anyone can handle it, it's you." Evie flushed slightly, ducking her head. "Thanks, Marcellus." Frida clucked her tongue, stepping between them as if sensing the weight of their unspoken connection. "I told him not to come empty-handed, so he insisted on bringing you these." She pulled a small bundle of legal pads from her bag, the kind Marcellus always seemed to have on hand. "For your notes or doodles or whipping up new recipes." Evie laughed, taking the pads with a grateful smile. "They'll come in handy. Thank you, Frida." The three of them chatted for a while, the conversation warm and easy. Marcellus kept the tone light, throwing in a few dry jokes about Stony Fork's gossip mill and how he'd barely had time to handle work with all the questions people kept asking him about Hugo's arrest. As they prepared to leave, Marcellus lingered near the door, his expression growing serious. "Evie," he said softly, "if you need anything at all, you know where to find me." "I know," Evie said, her voice steady. "Thank you." Marcellus hesitated for a moment, his gaze holding hers, before giving her a small smile and stepping outside. Frida shot Evie a knowing look as she followed him, and Evie couldn't help but laugh softly to herself as the bell jingled behind them.
"Evie?"
Tony Young called as she appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He stood near the counter, holding a large white box tied with a red ribbon. "I figured you could use some sugar. Made you my famous apple crumble and a few muffins." Evie's heart warmed at the sight of him. "Tony, you didn't have to." "Don't even try to argue," he said, setting the box down. "You've been through enough, and I know Lizzie would have insisted on feeding you if she were here." Evie smiled, her throat tightening at the mention of Lizzie. "Thank you, really." Tony waved a hand, brushing off her gratitude. "We all look out for each other here. Just let me know if you need anything else." As he headed out, Al strode in, her bright red braids swinging and a thermos tucked under her arm. "Hey, girl," she said, her voice warm and familiar. "Figured you could use some company. And coffee." Evie chuckled despite herself. "You know me too well." Al set the thermos on the counter and leaned in conspiratorially. And don't think I'm leaving until I've seen this infamous Hugo display for myself. The man's got nerve, I'll give him that. The two women chatted for a while, Al's easy humor lifting Evie's spirits. When she left, Evie felt lighter, as if the weight of the past few days had eased, if only slightly. Later that afternoon, the bell rang again, and Evie looked up to see an unexpected figure step into the shop. Mabel Roan stood in the doorway, her usual dramatic caftan replaced by a simple cardigan and jeans. Her expression was uncharacteristically subdued. "Mabel," Evie said, surprised. "What brings you here?" Mabel hesitated, her eyes darting around the shop before settling on Evie. "I heard what happened," she mumbled. "And I wanted to check on you." Evie blinked. Of all the people in town, Mabel was the last person she expected to show up. "That's really kind of you." Mabel shifted awkwardly, as if unsure what to do with her hands. "I know we've had our differences, and I know I've come across as difficult. But Lizzie was a good woman, and I'm sorry for what you've been through." The sincerity in her voice took Evie off guard. "Thank you," she said, her tone genuine. Mabel nodded, her usual bravado tempered by something quieter, almost vulnerable. "If you need anything, just let me know. I mean it." As she left, Evie couldn't help but wonder if there was more to Mabel than she'd realized. Maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for them to move past the tension and find some common ground. That evening, Sheriff Joe Stone stopped by, his presence filling the small shop with a sense of calm authority. He removed his hat as he stepped inside, his blue eyes scanning the room before landing on Evie. "Just wanted to check in," he said, his tone gentle. "How are you holding up?" "I'm managing," Evie replied, gesturing for him to sit at the counter. "It's been a lot to process." Joe nodded, his expression understanding. "I wanted to give you an update on the case. We've got more than enough evidence to charge Hugo with first-degree premeditated murder and attempted murder. Found a partial fingerprint on the greenhouse door and a muddy footprint that matches his shoes. Between that and his confession, it's airtight." Evie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Thank you, Joe. That's a relief." "You might be called to testify," Joe added. "But with the evidence we've got, I don't think it'll come to that." "I'll do whatever it takes," Evie said firmly. Joe smiled faintly. "Lizzie would be proud of you, you know. You're a lot like her." The words hit Evie squarely in the chest, filling her with both pride and sadness. "Thanks, Joe." As he stood to leave, he paused, his gaze steady. "And if you ever need anything at all, you let me know." "I will," Evie promised. That night, after Spinks had settled on the couch and the shop was quiet, Evie sat at Lizzie's desk, staring at the roll top and the secrets it held. Her mind kept returning to Hugo's words, his cryptic confession about Lizzie having something he wanted. Her eyes drifted to the hidden drawer, where the crypto arcanum sat in silence. She hadn't touched it since the night Hugo attacked her, but she could feel its presence, almost like a pulse in the room. "Lizzie," she whispered, her voice barely audible, "what were you protecting? And what does this book want from me?" James appeared beside her, his expression pensive. "It's not over, Evie. Whatever Hugo wanted, it's tied to that book. And he may not be the only one." Evie shivered, the weight of his words settling over her like a heavy blanket. She reached out, running her fingers along the edge of the desk. "I'll figure it out," she whispered, "for Lizzie and for me." As the clock struck midnight, Evie felt a strange sense of peace settle over her, mingled with the faintest hint of anticipation. The mystery wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time in weeks, she felt ready to face whatever came next.